All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for braving the rain to be here at 9 a.m. Super appreciated. Okay, so yeah, obviously I'm not Michael. I'll be filling in today for lecture. My name is Sydney. I'm currently a postdoc in Michael's lab. I also did my PhD with him, so I've been working with him for a while. And yeah, I'll be talking today about offline PBVI solutions. But just quickly before I get into that, I want to give a quick little plug for a course that I teach in the winter quarter. It's actually just this exact same course number, but with a V at the end. And it's a kind of a nice follow-on, I would say. It's called Validation of Safety Critical Systems. So you should be able to enroll in that for winter quarter. It uses a textbook that's very similar to the textbook for this class, but instead of algorithms for decision making, it's algorithms for validation. And I was a co-author on this book. And as you maybe have realized, there's kind of a series of these algorithms books that Michael's written. And they all have corresponding courses at Stanford. So this is obviously the course for the decision-making book. And then in the spring, Michael also teaches an optimization course. And the way that I kind of see all of these fitting together is that, in these first two, we basically learn how to design stuff. So in this class, you're like learning how to design decision-making systems. And then, you can take a class in the spring that teaches you how to optimize them. And then once you're kind of done with those classes, in the class that I teach in the winter, we talk about how to check if what you designed actually does what you intended it to do, which can be really important, especially when you're deploying these things in industry. You want to check that they're doing what they're supposed to before you actually go deploy them in the real world. And just in case this kind of setup doesn't resonate with you, here's one more way to put it. So, in this class, and thank you for laughing, I'm so appreciative. Honestly, the jokes throughout the rest of this lecture are just going to get progressively worse, so I'm happy you at least laughed at that one. Okay, but, in this class, we're just messing around a little bit, but if you want to find out, you can take my class in winter quarter. It will be structured very similarly to this class, so if you like the structure of this class, it'll be similar. Lectures will be similar to the lecture I'm going to give today. And yeah, hope to see many of you there. Oh, and I was told to say that it will count towards the MSCS AI depth requirement. So if that also helps convince you to take the class, you have that piece of knowledge as well. Okay, so yes, coming up in next quarter. All right, so let's jump in here. So last lecture, you learned about exact PBVI solutions, but probably towards the end of lecture, you learned something, which is that basically these methods are typically just completely intractable, even for moderate problem sizes. So you probably learned about a couple different ways to exactly solve PBVIs. One was this idea of a belief state Markov decision process, where you just said, okay, we have beliefs now instead of knowing our actual state. So let's just make the state of our Markov decision process the belief. And we could do that, but then the big problem there is that the belief space is continuous, so then the state space is continuous, and then when we have a continuous state space, it's pretty hard to solve anything exactly. And so then we have a problem there. The other option for solving PBVIs exactly is exact value iteration. And so when you guys talked about this last time, you were probably talking about conditional plans and these alpha vectors and all this stuff. And you probably quickly saw that the number of alpha vectors that we had to keep track of grows exponentially with the time horizon. And this just becomes intractable super, super fast. So for example, this is a figure from the textbook for a PBVI where we only have 2 actions and 2 possible observations. So super small, you can think of the crying baby problem. But even just for a time horizon of 10 steps into the future, the possible number of conditional plans or alpha vectors that we may have to keep track of is 10 to the 338. So there's just absolutely no way we can do this, and it grows insanely fast. So in general, these exact methods, we can try to do them for smaller problems. Sometimes we can prune enough alpha vectors that it will work out. But in general, it's really hard to solve PBVIs exactly. So today, we're going to be talking about approximate methods for solving PBVIs. So these are much more scalable. Unfortunately, we won't get the exact optimal policy, but we can at least try to get an approximation that's as good as possible. And today we're going to talk about approximate offline methods, meaning we do all of the computation before we actually deploy the system, and then once we deploy the system, it just executes this policy that we computed offline. Next week, you'll talk about online methods. All right. So let's I want to zoom out. So I know last time you were talking a bunch about these like things called conditional plans and all this stuff. I want to forget about that for a second and just zoom out and kind of think of like the most obvious thing you might do when solving a POMDP, given your knowledge of MDPs. So let's use this like aircraft collision avoidance example, which hopefully you've seen a number of times in this class. And so we have this like blue aircraft here. It's got some collision avoidance system that needs to select actions like climb or descend to avoid colliding with this red aircraft over here. And of course, we could have like any number of states that this aircraft could be in. We're going to keep it really simple just for this example. We're going to say there's just like 5 possible states that it could be in. That describes kind of its like relative geometry with respect to the intruder aircraft, this red aircraft over here. Okay, and so for an MDP, earlier in the quarter, you learned about how to create an MDP policy for a system like this. And one of the techniques you probably learned about was to kind of solve for the state action value function, this Q function here, that for every single state action pair, we solve for a value that says, like, if we were to take that action from that state and follow our optimal policy, what would be our expected utility, our expected return? And so to execute this policy online, so here I'm showing it for each of our particular states. So for this state, here's the value associated with the climb action. Here's the expected utility associated with just staying level, and then here's the expected utility with descending. And then so on for all of these. So it should make sense here, like for the climb action, that's probably the best thing we can do here, so we'll have the highest expected utility for that. Also, there's one tiny mistake on this slide that I forgot to fix. Can anyone spot it? I will say, when I showed Michael these slides last week, he spotted it almost instantly before I said any words. It has nothing to do with the math. Okay, well, basically the problem is, which Michael will harp on you for, is that this should actually be in math mode, so the dash should actually be a minus sign, but because it's not in math mode, they're just a little too short. And Michael will spot these things. Like, as I worked with him for 7 years now, and he'll see it as fast as possible. But anyway, so Michael, if you're watching this back later, I'm really sorry for doing that. I didn't fix it. Okay, anyway, so here's our policy. And so now if we were going to execute this policy, with an MDP, we actually know what state we're currently in. So let's say that we knew that we're in S2, because for MDPs, we have full observability, we know our state. So then we'll just look at our action values for that, and then we'll just pick the action with the highest value, and we'll take that, and that's how we execute our policy. Okay, so the problem here, though, is that we're not in MDP land anymore. So we don't actually know the exact state that we're in, and we have to go off something else to actually decide what action we want to take at every time step. So we can think about what do we know? These are things that you've talked about before. So really all we have is this history of observations and actions. So we don't get to know the state, we do get noisy observations of that state, and then we also know what action we took at every time step leading up to where we currently are. And then a couple lectures ago, you learned how to take that history and summarize it as a belief state, which basically is just a probability distribution over what state we're in. So typically what we do is that we make decisions when we're executing our POMDP policy by looking at our current belief and deciding what action is best to take based on the belief, or this probability distribution over what state we're in. So if we go back to this problem, this time we don't know which state we're in. We only have a belief over which state we might be in. So for example, we still have the highest probability that we're in S2, but we also have some probability that we're actually in S1 or S3 and so on. And so you can kind of see the weighting here. And so instead of knowing we're in this state, we have a full distribution over the states that we could possibly be in. And now let's kind of start with the idea that you're probably all itching to do, or at least if you're me, when I first saw POMDPs, I was like, why don't we just do this? This just seems like the most obvious thing to do. And I would say that is to well, we have all these Q values if we just solved it like an MDP. So why don't we just weight the Q values the same way that we weight the belief, and then just combine all of those in some weighted average of all the Q values about depending on how likely it was to be in each state for those Q values. So that's all I've done here. And then just pick the action that's the highest for that weighted average. And And so this equation is just describing exactly what I did. We're just saying, like, take the Q values for a particular state and then weight it by how likely we are to be in that state. We'll take that weighted average, and then we'll pick our action based on that weighted average. So all we're doing really is like interpolating all the Q values based on our belief over where we are. Okay, and so unsurprisingly, this method is actually called QMDP. It is a POMDP method, and it does actually work pretty well in a number of scenarios. We're going to talk shortly about some scenarios where it kind of breaks down. But one thing that's kind of cool is Michael has probably talked about the ACAS-X collision avoidance system a little bit throughout this course, and this is actually the method that they use for ACAS-X. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so to recap how QMDP works, first we'll just like pretend it's an MDP, pretend we have full observability, ignore the observation model, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll just get the optimal state action value function for that. So for example, using value iteration. And then we're going to just take the weighted sum of those Q values based on our current belief, and that's going to be how we execute our policy. So again, here's what that looks like. So this is just taking that weighted average that I showed before of our Q values, and then we're going to look at what that looks like for all of our possible actions, and we're going to pick the action that maximizes that weighted average. Okay, any questions up to this point? Okay, cool. So now I'm going to do something. So this is like the crux of QMDP. This is like all that's going on. I'm going to now introduce QMDP in terms of alpha vectors, but all we're doing is kind of changing up notation. And the reason for that is because like when we talk about POMDPs, we often talk about alpha vectors. And so like for the rest of the lecture, once we get away from QMDP, we're still going to be talking about alpha vectors. So we want all of these things to like relate nicely to each other. But I think it's also easy to get like really tripped up as soon as we start like switching over to alpha vectors. So I'm going to try to like go slow and explain it in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I just want you to keep in mind this whole time, like we're still just doing exactly what I said, just interpolating Q values. But I'm going to talk about it in terms of alpha vectors now. And so to do that, all I'm going to do is in this equation here, instead of calling this QSA, I'm just going to call it an alpha vector. So I'm going to say I have an alpha vector for each action, and then it has an entry for every single state. So all I did here is replace this QSA with new notation that's just alpha subscript A of S. So it's an alpha vector now. That's it. Okay, so these are the exact same thing. It's just that we're changing up the notation a little bit. And then what we're saying here basically is QMDP gives us a POMDP policy where we have one alpha vector for every single action, and it just corresponds to the state action value function for that action at each possible state. Okay, any questions on that? All right. Okay, so like, oh, you have a question, yeah.
So if your Q is of dimensions like 50 states and like 4 actions, then you have 4 alpha vectors, each of length 50.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and so I think alpha vectors, like, I don't know, when I first heard about them, I was like, what is this? It didn't really click in my mind. So I'm gonna try to explain them in a whole bunch of different ways during this lecture. So that kind of leads me into a reminder on alpha vectors here. Okay, so here's an alpha vector. Please don't confuse it with a millennial vector. Oh my goodness, thank you for laughing. Okay, I'm so relieved that you laughed at this. Okay. Anyway, all right. Here's an actual alpha vector. I'll send out the slides after if you want that graphic. Okay, here's an actual alpha vector that we could have for our collision avoidance example. Okay, so alpha vectors, they have one entry for every state. So just like the question we just got, if we have 50 states, we'll have 50 entries in our alpha vector. And so in the example I've been showing you, we had 5 states, so we'll have one entry for each of those states. And what you want to keep in mind here is that like basically each of these entries represent the expected utility of like if we were actually in this state, so if we were actually in state S1 and we executed our POMDP policy. So when we're actually executing the policy, we don't know what state we're in. But if we were in this state, this is like the expected utility that we would have gotten for like all future utilities. Okay, and so it has this nice mapping to the Q values for MDPs, because those are also the expected utility. Okay, and so then the POMDP value at function estimate is just like a weighted sum of these alpha vectors. So we say like, okay, this is the expected utility of being in that particular state. I'll take the weighted sum with like the likelihood that we actually are in that particular state, and that gives us our expected utility, given that we don't know the current state that we're in, we just have this distribution over it, and then we'll just take the action that maximizes that. So we'll try this for all of our different alpha vectors, one for each action, and we'll take the max, we'll take the action that corresponds to the max. And that will give us our actual POMDP value function. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay, so just some more intuition here. So what I want you to remember is that like if we had the alpha vectors for the optimal value function, then each entry in that alpha vector would represent the expected utility of if we were in that state and we followed the optimal policy from there on out. So basically the idea here is just that like each entry is just corresponding to like our expected utility if we were in that state. There's some set of alpha vectors that actually makes up the optimal policy, which will give us the optimal value function. But as we saw in like the last lecture, that's typically intractable to find because it required either a belief state MDP or exact value iteration, and those like super quickly became intractable. So typically we can't actually find those alpha vectors that we want to find. And so what we do with these offline approximate techniques is basically we're just trying to like find a set of alpha vectors that approximate the optimal ones as best as we can. So again, we don't know what the optimal ones are typically, and so we're just going to try to kind of come up with all these different heuristics and ideas that get us a good set of alpha vectors that's kind of close to the optimal policy so that we can get as good a policy as possible. So if you're like getting tripped up with all the like dimensions and math of alpha vectors, hopefully you can kind of go back to this intuition, because that's really all that's going on there. We're just trying to get like some good sets of alpha vectors, and there's lots of different ways to try to do that. Okay, so that's kind of a reminder on alpha vectors. We'll come back to it a few more times as well. But okay, so now let's look at what QMDP looks like in terms of alpha vectors. So again, this is just changing up notation. We're not doing anything different than what I showed you before. But here like would be an alpha vector actually for the climb action. And all we're doing is we're just taking the Q value that corresponds to the climb action for each possible state, and we're just stacking them all together. Okay, and then we have an alpha vector. We're going to have 3 alpha vectors for this particular example because there's 3 actions: climb, stay the same, or descend. So then for like stay the same or stay level, then we're going to take all the state action values for that particular action across all the states, just stack them together, and then we'll have a 3rd alpha vector for the descend action that we get in a similar way. And then all we do is just now these Q values are just kind of squashed into different vectors, but we just do the same exact thing. We just take the weighted average of them, and that gives us one value for each action. So we're going to get, doing this, we get one value for each action, and then we're going to take the max, and that's how we'll decide what action to take. Okay, so this is all exactly the same as interpolating the Q values. This is what it looks like in terms of alpha vectors. Any questions there? Okay. Cool. Okay, so this is QMDP. There is one problem with QMDP. So like I said, we're going to set our alpha vectors, one for each action, equal to the Q values. And if you remember how you compute Q values, kind of thinking back to value iteration for MDPs and the Bellman equation, you have like your immediate reward plus this kind of expected future utility. And when we calculate this expected future utility, there's no notion of like observations or beliefs or anything like that. And in fact, basically what this is doing is kind of making the assumption that at the next time step, we just know what our true state is. And so that can be an issue. Can anyone think of like what might be the problem there? So I'll try to make it a little more concrete. So say I like told you that I'll give you option A and B next Thursday. And if you pick the right option, I'll give you $1,000. And if you pick the wrong option, then I'm not going to give you anything. And you can actually, drive, let's say, down to San Jose and go to this like one location, and it'll tell you whether A or B is the correct answer. This is getting really convoluted, but let's say that this is the scenario I presented you with. But either you can do that, you can take that action sometime before next Thursday when you have to pick A or B, or tomorrow you'll just know, just magically, whether A or B is the correct answer. Are you going to go drive down to San Jose? Like, probably not. There's no reason to, because tomorrow, magically apparently, you're just going to like know what the right answer is. So if we're doing that here, we're just saying like our value function is just assuming that at the next time step we're going to know the true state, then we're never kind of incentivized to actually take information gathering actions that would otherwise be costly. But in POMDPs, that can actually be a really good thing to do, because like you're not actually magically going to know whether A or B is the correct answer tomorrow, and so you actually would probably want to go drive down to San Jose, depending on how much you care about getting $1,000. And so in general, like the thing with QMDP is just that the policy is not really ever incentivized to take information gathering actions, because if it thinks that it's going to know the true state at the next time step, why would it ever take an action to like try to get more information on what state it's in? So that's one thing to keep in mind with QMDP. It does still work well. Like I said, they actually use it for ACAS-X because they didn't really have a need necessarily to take information gathering actions for collision avoidance. If you just kind of keep filtering, your state you'll get a better state estimate. But for other problems, like, I don't know, for example, like hide and seek or something, like maybe it actually matters to try to take these information gathering actions. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay. And then another thing that kind of comes as a result of this is that since QMDP assumes this like full observability at the next time step, it's going to end up providing us an upper bound on the true value function. So those alpha vectors we get out from the Q values, they're going to represent upper bound on the true value function. And the way to think of this is just that we're not going to be able to do better than the full observability case. Like if you actually knew your state, then you would be able to do a much better job. So that's why it's going to give us an upper bound. Okay, so let's actually look at what this looks like in terms of an example. We'll use the simplified crying baby problem. So we have two states. The baby's either not hungry or hungry. Two observations. So we don't get to know whether or not the baby's hungry. We just get to observe whether or not it's crying. And then two actions. We can either feed the baby or ignore it. Okay, so let's talk about one more angle to kind of look at alpha vectors. So let's see what the alpha vectors would look like for this problem, particularly, for example, for QMDP. So an alpha vector for this problem, again, we have one entry for each possible state. So we just have two states stated in hungry. And then each one is going to represent the expected utility for being in that state and following our policy. So the expected utility when the baby is not hungry, and then the second entry will be the expected utility when the baby is hungry. So if we were going to do QMDP for this problem, we have two actions, so we would have two alpha vectors, each with two entries, one for each state. So let's say, for example, maybe we have like these two alpha vectors, this for action 1 where we feed the baby, and then this alpha vector for action 2 where we don't feed the baby. And probably last week you saw or earlier this week you saw some plots that look like this. Basically, we can, because the problem is so low dimensional, we can actually plot what these alpha vectors look like, which is kind of helpful, I think, for visualization. So on this axis, we're just going to be plotting like B of S2, so our belief of being in the state hungry. So in other words, the probability that the baby is hungry. And because there's only two states, if we're not hungry, we know that we're in the other state. So this basically entirely represents the belief space, because if our P of being hungry was like 0.8 or something, then we automatically know what the probability of the other state is. It'll just be 0.2. So we really only need like one dimension to represent our whole belief space for this particular problem, which is nice, because then we can plot it. Okay, so then we'll plot what these alpha vectors look like, considering, and this is our expected utility, considering like what these different points represent on the plot. So when P of hungry is equal to 1, we basically know for a fact that the baby is hungry, so we know that we're in state S2. And then on the flip side, when P of hungry is 0, we know that the baby is sated, we know that for sure that we're in that state. And because these values represent the expected utility, when we know for sure that we're in those states, we can just like plot these values. So for the feed action, for example, we know that when the baby's not hungry and we're in that state for sure, then we get an expected utility of -4, so we can just like plot that for that point. And then we also know that when the baby is hungry, for sure, we get an expected value of, or expected utility of -10. And then somewhere in between, all we do with the alpha vector is like interpolate those values, right? Because all we're doing is taking our belief vector and multiplying it by this alpha vector, which just equates to interpolating those values. So that makes sense, right? Because as our probability of being hungry is closer to knowing for sure that it's hungry, our expected utility is probably also closer to that. And it turns out it's literally just kind of a straight line in between those two. So that's kind of another way to visually picture an alpha vector. It's kind of like cutting the space of the utility function. And then this corresponds to the action of feeding the baby. Okay, then we can do the same thing for our other alpha vector. So -1 when we know the baby's not hungry, -15 if we know the baby is hungry and we choose to ignore it. So right, that makes sense. If we know the baby is hungry and we choose to feed it, then we do much better than if we know it's hungry and we choose to ignore it. Okay, and then again we just can like connect these values and we get another alpha vector. And then the optimal policy is just kind of the maximum over these. So it'll be this. And then, for example, the way we execute this policy is we say, okay, well, let's say that we actually believe that there's a 0.1 probability that the baby is hungry. And so that tells us we'll go to the alpha vector that kind of dominates there, and that tells us to ignore the baby. And then, kind of unsurprisingly, if we have like a 0.9 probability that the baby is hungry, then this other alpha vector dominates and we decide to feed it. Okay, so I think for some reason like this took me a while to get in my head like what all of this actually represents, but hopefully this kind of helps with some intuition here. Are there any questions on that? Okay. Awesome. Okay. For QMDP, when we have all of these alpha vectors, so again, we'll initialize our Q function as if we were doing like value iteration, for example, and then we do this iteration. This is just exactly value iteration on the underlying MDP. But in terms of alpha vectors, it would look like this. So all we did was replace the Q's with alphas. That's it, just changed up the notation. But then we can kind of see what this looks like in terms of alpha vectors when we do value iteration over time. So this is what it looks like for the crying baby problem. For the crying baby problem, we actually can solve it exactly, so that's kind of cool. So we can actually see how close we're getting to the optimal value function, which is the one that's shown in black. And then here we initialize to an upper bound, and then we slowly move towards like a tighter and tighter upper bound on the true value function, and then we converge down here. Okay, and so as I kind of just slipped in there, like basically as long as we initialize our alpha vectors to an upper bound, no matter kind of how many iterations we do of value iteration, even if we don't go all the way to convergence, we're always going to have an upper bound on the true value function. Okay, and so, yeah, actually, are there any questions on that? Yeah.
Isn't it like kind of dangerous to have your estimate be like an overestimate, like an overly optimistic estimate of your like value function? Because like in like safety critical scenarios, you wouldn't want to overestimate the likelihood of not crashing the plane. So like how, especially if you can't go all the way to convergence, like how can you have a metric for knowing like, okay, my like upper bound estimate is like within reasonable, like just like a reasonably close to the actual one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right. So the question was like, what do we do about the fact that like if it's an upper bound, isn't that like kind of maybe not the best thing to go off of, especially if we want to be like conservative in like a safety critical setting? And I would say like, yeah, you're absolutely right. We're going to talk in a minute about how to get some lower bounds. So that's also another way to know how off you might be, because you can have the upper bound and the lower bound, and then you know exactly the gap of like where the optimal value function could lie. So we'll talk in a bit about how to get lower bounds. Another thing to think about, though, is like even though this upper bound has kind of a big gap, if you actually think about like the difference between the optimal policy for like, our optimal value function and the optimal policy for this value function, they're like not that different, right? Because like for the optimal value function, it's basically like we have one alpha vector. I'm going to guess this is for like not feeding the baby, because down here like we don't have a very high probability that the baby is hungry. So this alpha vector is for like not feeding the baby. So we wouldn't feed the baby as long as this alpha vector dominates. So that's till about right here. So that means like until we get to a belief around, I don't know, like 0.28 or something, we would like not feed the baby. And then if we had more than a 0.28 belief that the baby was hungry, we would feed the baby. And if we look at the optimal alpha vector here, like, I don't know, maybe that transitions at like 0.33. So it's like not that different of a policy. So there is kind of a difference between, getting the right value function, but also like these value functions just correspond to the policies we're going to execute. And so even though there's a big gap here, like there's not a huge gap in the optimal policy.
So what matters more is that your vertices, like how much your vertices shift as you iterate through, like closer to the vertex. Like it would be a bigger issue if that corner between
was like over here
and the vertex one were really far away.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As long as all you're doing with the value function is using it to decide how to execute your policy, which is typically what you're doing, but yeah.
I don't get why the value function would decrease for every iteration as you're computing the maximum for all potential exceptions.
So the question is, why does the value function decrease at every iteration if you're like maximizing over actions? This will only happen if you initialize to an upper bound on the value function. So for example, think about like doing MDP value iteration. Say you just initialize to some upper bound where you know that your policy could never do better than that. You're getting to the optimal policy for the MDP. So like you're going to have to move down towards what's actually true. Any other questions? These are great questions. Okay, cool. Okay, so like I said, though, you have to initialize to some like initial upper bound. And so you might be wondering, like, how could we actually get this initial upper bound? And so one common way to do it is this idea of a best action, best state upper bound, where we just say, like, okay, imagine if, like, this is probably not possible, but let's imagine that we were able to take the best action from the best state forever. So we look at all our, like, RSA pairs, like all our reward pairs, and we just say, like, what if I could just stay in this like one state, like maybe it's the goal state or something, and take the same action forever, and I just like keep accumulating that reward forever into the future. So probably we can't do that, like given the transition model of our MDP. But if we could, you'd probably agree that that's like the best we could do. Like we could never do better than taking the best action from the best state forever. So to do that, we just say like, okay, let's look for that RSA pair that corresponds to that best state action pair. Let's assume we do it forever, so that means we're going to apply our discount factor, but just like sum it up forever into the future. And if you remember for the formula for like infinite sums, it comes out to this. So you can actually calculate analytically what that upper bound would be. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay, so again, QMDP is going to provide an upper bound on the true value function, but it's actually possible to get a tighter upper bound by taking the observation model into account to some extent. So with QMDP, we just like ignored the fact that we're in POMDP land at all, and we were just like, let's just solve for the value function as if it were an MDP. We can actually do a little better if we sort of somewhat take into account the observation model. And the technique that does this is called fast informed bound. And it's super similar. We're doing something very similar to kind of the Bellman equation that we were doing before, but now we're actually going to take into account this observation model. So everything's exactly the same, except we're now going to take into account the information that at the next time step, we're not going to know our true state. We're actually going to get some observation of our true state. and we'll actually sum over all of the different possible observations that we might get. So that's all that's going on. We're just saying at the next time step, we'll actually consider the observation model a little bit, and we'll say that we actually get some observations. Okay, and so just comparing QMDP and fast-informed bound, they're extremely similar. We'll still, for fast-informed bound, we still have one alpha vector per action. It's the same exact thing. It's just that in that iterative procedure, similar to value iteration, we're going to have this extra term where we sum over all of the different observations we might get. And so because of that, it is a little bit more complex in terms of computation, or in terms of like operations per iteration, because now we have this extra factor of O, the number of observations, because we have to sum over all of these observations. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, but it does tend to give us a tighter bound on the actual true value function. So here's, again, for QMDP, what we just saw, and then over here is for fast-informed bound for the crying baby problem, and you can see it gives us actually a much tighter upper bound. So that's one benefit of this kind of added computational complexity. Questions on that? Yeah.
That stuff over there, you say the max is at 8 prime, I only see A.
This is A prime here. So this A corresponds to the current alpha vector we're doing the action for, and this is like all the actions we could take at the next time step. Yeah, good question. It's kind of hard to keep track of all of these. I would recommend just kind of staring at this equation for a bit to like parse what's actually going on in all these sums. But good question. Yeah.
And also, like, as prime, shouldn't it make that prime be inside itself?
Great question. That one I think is probably a typo. Yeah, great question. I'll double check, update the slides before I send them out. The correct equation is definitely in the book though. But yeah. Yes. Other questions? Okay. All right, so everything we learned about so far gives us upper bounds, and we maintain one alpha vector for every single action. But that doesn't necessarily, so again, like all these methods, we're just trying to find alpha vectors that best approximate the alpha vectors of the true optimal policy. And no one said that necessarily the true optimal policy has one alpha vector per action. Like that's not necessarily true. We're just making that assumption for those methods. And so maybe it's actually possible we could do better if we could have just like more alpha vectors. We weren't tied to just having like one alpha vector per action. And so one method for doing this is called point-based value iteration. So it's really a super cool method. So emphasis on the base, you know, it's based. Okay. I told you they were going to get progressively worse. All right. So the key idea with point-based value iteration is that we're going to maintain a bunch of alpha vectors in this kind of group that we call capital gamma. And that each of these alpha vectors is going to be associated with a different point in our belief space, and we'll keep track of all of those points in this set we call B. Okay, so just visually, like we have this set gamma, and it just has a bunch of different alpha vectors in it for now. So like how we get those and whatnot we'll be talking about, but just for now, just assume like we have this set gamma that has a whole bunch of alpha vectors in it. And then we also have this corresponding set of beliefs where every single alpha vector corresponds to one belief in our other set of beliefs. Okay, so don't worry about how we got any of these. We'll talk about that. But this is just like something we have for point-based value iteration. And then just like this kind of set of alpha vectors, that represents a policy. So like any set of alpha vectors represents a policy, right? We're just trying to find the set that gets us to the optimal policy. But given any set, we can just like derive a policy from that, because this is just the exact same equation we had before in vector form. We just take the weighted sum of our belief state and the alpha vector, which represents the expected utility of being in every state. And then we pick the action for the alpha vector that corresponds to the highest value for this. So again, you can kind of think of this like bag of alpha vectors as just like a policy, basically. And what we're going to do is we're just going to try to kind of iteratively improve all the alpha vectors in this bag of alpha vectors to get us as close as we can to the optimal policy. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is initialize all of the alpha vectors in that bag in gamma to a lower bound on the value function. Okay, how do we get a lower bound on the value function? Just basically the opposite of what we were doing before. We can do best action worst state lower bound. So imagine we have all those RSA pairs. We first figure out like what's the worst case state we would be in where we could still take the best action from that state, but what's the worst case state that we could be in to have that happen? So again, imagine if we were able to do that forever. And then again, this gets a little funky with the notation because you have like a max and a min in it, but it's just doing the exact same thing. So we're just saying like, let's say we do that forever, we take into account the discount factor, we use the formula for infinite sums, and it comes out to this. So we can get a lower bound on the value function by just assuming that like, you know, worst case, we're like stuck in the worst state forever and we just keep taking the best possible action. Okay. There's also one way to get another lower bound. So for point-based value iteration, we're actually just going to use this lower bound. But just for completeness of what's in the book, you can actually get a slightly tighter lower bound by maintaining a different lower bound for every single action. And that just assumes, like, say we just had a policy where we just took the same action forever, no matter what our belief was. Maybe that's the optimal policy, which, you know, in that case, it's a tight lower bound. It's probably not the optimal policy. And so in general, like, we're going to do worse by doing that, so that should give us a lower bound on our value function. And the way to calculate that is basically just, like, applying this Bellman-like equation, but just assuming that we're always taking the same action. So we don't even maximize over actions here or anything like that. We just assume that every single time we take the same action, and we compute the value function if we do that. And that will give us a different lower bound for every single action. So that's one thing, and it'll tend to be tighter than this best action, worst state lower bound. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So, when you say tighter lower bound, do you mean a slightly less conservative lower bound?
Yeah, tighter would mean it's actually higher than the other lower bound, so it's closer to the optimal value function.
Because you're not just uniformly assuming the worst possible state, or like...
Yeah, so the worst thing we could do would be to take the best action from the worst state forever. Right. We'll do better probably by taking the same action and actually like moving from state to state.
So could you tell me what only the difference between, you say take a different lower bound for each action. So for each action, you basically iterate through the actions from the worst case state.
So this is completely different. So there's no notion of worst state here. You're basically computing it for every single state, and you're just saying like, let's say I was using a policy where I just took the same action all the time. So this one is saying like, let's say I was stuck in the worst state forever and I just kept taking the best action. It might not be feasible given like the actual transition model of the POMDP, but like you know that you won't be doing worse than that then. Here is saying like, let's actually use the transition model of the actual POMDP, but let's just assume that our policy is to take the same action forever. And a policy that just takes the same action forever, you know, it's not going to be worse than this one that we're stuck in the worst state forever.
Okay, but isn't it also possible that taking the same action forever isn't? I guess it is always feasible, right? Because you could take any action from a given state. So you're just. Okay.
Yeah. So it's basically like. You can imagine like any policy will give you a lower bound on the value function because like if it's not the optimal policy, then yeah. So the policy of taking the same action forever, it's easy to calculate the alpha vectors for that, so that's why we pick that, but that will give us a lower bound.
is there like a specific choice of action that you need to take for this? Like, you have to choose the action that gives you the worst, that on average gives you like the worst, like reward or something? Like,
you could do this for like all of the actions, and then like take the max over them all. It'll give you a set of alpha vectors, and you can like take the max over them all to get like that piecewise continuous value function. You could also just do it for one, and it will give you just one lower bound. Really, like these things are mostly like, you wouldn't actually use these to like select a POMDP policy. You typically use these types of things to initialize another algorithm, like point-based value iteration, which is what we're talking about now. So typically you just want something like fast that will get you a lower bound that you know for sure is a lower bound, and then you can like improve on it using these other algorithms. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so like I said, for the purposes of this lecture anyway, we're just going to assume we use that best action worst state lower bound, and we'll initialize all of our alpha vectors to that lower bound. Okay, so then after that, we also have these corresponding belief points. I haven't told you yet how you get the belief points. All I've told you is that you have one belief point per alpha vector that you have in that kind of bag of alpha vectors that we're keeping track of. We'll talk towards the end of the lecture about how you could actually go about picking them. But let's just assume that we've like picked a set of belief points, and each one corresponds to one of these alpha vectors. Okay, and then what we do is we're going to iterate through each belief point, and we're going to do something called a backup. Okay, a backup, like alpha vectors, is another thing that like when I first heard of it, it was really hard to get it to click in my mind. So I'm going to try to show it to you, like what a backup does in a couple different ways. Okay, so basically, again, we have this kind of bag of alpha vectors. And like I said, this kind of bag of alpha vectors represents a policy. So like any set of alpha vectors, we could, take the dot product with our belief vector, pick the one that maximizes it, take the action corresponding to that alpha vector, and that's how we execute a policy. So like any set of alpha vectors gives us a policy. So we have our current policy. And what we're going to do every time we do a backup is we're going to try to basically improve this policy by making these alpha vectors represent something that's closer to the optimal set of alpha vectors. And the way that we do this is we first say, like, okay, so we're going to do this for a particular belief. So every time we perform a backup, it's just at one of our particular beliefs. So for example, B1, we'll just take the first one. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves, like, okay, what new alpha vector could we replace alpha 1 with that's actually a better estimate of the expected return at the current belief, given this current policy that we have represented here? Okay, so basically we're going to generate a new alpha vector that kind of gets closer to what the true expected value function is. Okay, so that like intuitively, that's all that's happening. And if you want to abstract it even more, we're just like taking this belief and we're approving our value function estimate at that belief. Okay, so when we do that, we'll get this new alpha vector. We'll call it like alpha 1 prime. And then for point-based value iteration, what we'll do is we'll just take the current alpha 1 and we'll just replace it with this new alpha vector that we got from performing our backup. Okay, so that's just intuitively what's going on for a backup. And then we would do this again for our next belief, and we'll just iterate through all of them. So we'll update the value function there. What is like the best new alpha vector that gives us like a better estimate of the value function at this belief? We'll replace it in our current policy. And then for every iteration, we'll do that for all of them, and we'll just kind of like keep doing this for a while. Okay, so that's like the intuition I want you to have in mind of what's going on. There's of course like the actual math for like how do you actually do a backup. But I found if you like start with this, then like it can be really confusing. So I want you to still keep this intuition in mind. Okay, so the actual math that we do. So we're performing a backup at this like certain belief point, given this set of alpha vectors that we call capital gamma. And so what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through a few things. So we're going to do something for every possible action. We're going to go through every possible observation we could have when we take that action, and we're going to look at what new belief we would get. So every time we take an action and get a new observation, we can update our belief, and so we can figure out, given the methods that you learned in I think it was chapter 19, You know how to update the belief given an action and an observation that we got. And then we just want to figure out which alpha vector would dominate at that new belief. So we're going to, for each action observation pair, we're going to store which alpha vector would dominate if that were to be what happened, if we were to take that action and get that observation. Okay, so basically all this is saying is like, for each action observation pair, what alpha vector would dominate at our updated belief. Okay, then we're still doing this for each action. We're going to fill in this new alpha vector by basically looking at what would happen if we used this like value function at that new updated belief. So looking at like our expected future utility is based on that belief update that we did, given like the policy that we had before. Okay, so basically the idea here is just like using what would happen one time step in the future for each action observation pair, updating a belief, what would be our new expected utility at every single state. Okay, honestly, I don't feel like I'm doing that great of a job explaining this, but it's kind of like a tricky one to get in your head. So I'd recommend if you get a chance to like just kind of look at the book and look at these equations for a bit longer, or just go back to this intuition. But another way you can kind of think of it is we're kind of doing like an update of the Bellman equation similar to what's going on in value iteration, where we're getting like closer to the optimal policy every single time. It's just that we're doing it kind of at these discrete belief points, and so there's things we need to keep track of, like alpha vectors and our current optimal policy and observations and all these things. So that's what's going on. And we're going to do this for every single action, so we'll get a new alpha vector for every single action, and then we just get to replace our old alpha vector with one new alpha vector. So we're just going to pick the alpha vector for the action that dominates at that particular belief. Okay? So all of this math, all it's doing is saying, like, let's get a new alpha vector that better estimates the value function at the current belief, given the current policy that we have. Okay. Any questions there? Okay. So yeah, if you're like, I don't know what this math was, it's too hard for me to parse it that quickly, I certainly don't blame you. But just keep in mind for the rest of this lecture, like when we do a backup, we're just getting a new alpha vector that better estimates our value function at the current belief. Okay? Okay. So we're going to do this for a while. So at every single iteration, we're going to go through the beliefs and all the alpha vectors that we have. We're going to perform a backup at every single belief. And then we'll just repeat this process, and we'll do it a whole bunch of times. So the alpha vectors will kind of slowly move up from our lower bound. And then once we're done, the value function is just represented as kind of the max of all of those. And it turns out that this converges to a lower bound on the optimal value function. So here's what this looks like for the crying baby problem. We only used 2 beliefs here, actually. But you initialize to this lower bound, so this is the best action, worst state, lower bound. And then every single time you perform backups at both of these beliefs, and you get these new sets of alpha vectors, and eventually it converges to like a pretty tight lower bound on the value function, which is pretty cool. What questions do you have on that?
So in general, it looks like as you converge, the vertices or the piecewise transitions of your alpha vectors have the opposite trend when you go from a lower bound to like when you approach from a lower bound than it is when you approach from a lower bound. So if you look at the corners, like they're moving like inwards basically, before they're moving like. Or sorry, I guess it's not opposite. Is that true? Or is it the same behavior? Oh, it looks like it.
Yeah, it might be kind of different. I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to tell.
Typical, like should you see that your piecewise function kind of gets displaced in the same direction from iteration to iteration as it does, like from when you approach from below as it does when you approach from above?
It's a great question. Like, so basically the idea here is like, would there be like a straight line if we were to like do this kind of? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Not necessarily a straight line, but if you drew a line through all of the vertices, would it be continuous between the upper bound estimate and the lower bound?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. Like, my gut instinct would be no, because they seem kind of unrelated, and it probably very much depends on like what belief points you ended up picking for point-based value iteration. So yeah, good question. I don't know for sure if there's like actually a pattern there or a reason, or if it like just happened to be that way for this problem.
Because then that would allow you to like, if you have a trend for the upper bound estimate and the lower bound estimate, it would allow you to more easily like interpolate between the two. If the right, or is that not really how we're gonna?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought. Like, I don't know if people have explored the idea of like interpolating between the upper and lower bound. For this lecture, we're basically just going to talk about how to solve offline for upper and lower bounds. And like the PBVI results and QMDP, because that's what they use for AKSX, like they're useful on their own. But in the next lecture, you guys will talk more about like how to actually take advantage of the fact that we have both an upper and lower bound. So I would say stay tuned for next lecture. Yeah.
Why do we specifically take the lower bound for point-based value iteration, not the upper bound, and vice versa for QMDP?
Good question. So the question was like, for like the initialization, do you mean? Yeah, so the question was like for QMDP and FIB, like why do we initialize to an upper bound, whereas for point-based value iteration, we initialize to a lower bound? So basically the general idea is just that for QMDP, we already know that it's going to converge to an upper bound because we know that we can't do better than the full observability case. And so if we were going to run QMDP to convergence, then it would be fine. We could start from like any initialization that we wanted because we know that we're going to converge to this like final solution here, which will be an upper bound. But if we start with an upper bound, even if we don't run to convergence, say we stopped like here or something, then we at least know we still have an upper bound. So it's kind of a nice thing to have to know that like you don't necessarily have to run to convergence if you start with an upper bound. Similarly for point-based value iteration, we always know that it's going to be a lower bound on the value function, and so we want to initialize to a lower bound so that we know that like every time we perform these backups at our beliefs, we're getting closer to the true value function, but it will still be a lower bound. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
How do you decide the size of the set of alpha vectors that you start with and the number of belief points that you start with?
Yeah, great question. Okay, we're good. Stay tuned for the end of the lecture. We'll talk about it. Any other questions? Okay. So one problem with point-based value iteration is that we are maintaining an alpha vector for every single point in our set of beliefs. So if we did have, I'm going to tell you in a bit, like I just mentioned, how we actually can go about picking this like set of beliefs. But if we did have like a bunch of beliefs, it could be quite computationally expensive to like continue to update, perform backups at all of these beliefs and like maintain an alpha vector for all of them. So it turns out there is some way to improve this in an algorithm called randomized point-based value iteration. And the way this works, it's super similar to point-based value iteration. But all we're going to do is we're just going to start with like one alpha vector. And we're going to call this like B prime. We're just going to have a set of like candidate beliefs that we could perform backups at. And so we'll just start with one alpha vector at our best action, worst state, lower bound. And then we're just going to randomly pick a belief from like our set of candidate beliefs that we could pick from. So let's say that we just like randomly pick B2. And then we're going to take B2 and we're going to perform a backup just for B2. So we're going to get a new alpha vector by performing a backup at B2. And that's going to give us basically this new alpha vector. And really what we're going to do is, like we said, if we initialize to a lower bound, we're just going to continue to get closer and closer to the true value function as we perform these backups. And so really at every iteration, we kind of just like, every time we get a little closer, that's kind of an improvement. Every time that our value function goes up, that's an improvement for us. We know we're getting closer to the true value function. And so actually it turns out like not only did this make it better at B2, but it also made it better at B1, and it made it better at B3, and it made it better at B4. So maybe instead of like performing backups at B1, B2, at B1, B3, and B4 after this, like we would in point-based value iteration, maybe we just say like, that's good enough. Like for this iteration, we improved it at all of those. So let's not perform backups at those. Let's just take those out of our candidate belief that we could choose from. And we're just going to say for this iteration, good enough. We at least got some improvement at all of those beliefs. And then we'll just keep doing this. So we'll say, okay, now we only have B5 and B6 left to choose from. We'll randomly pick one. Let's say we pick B6. So we'll perform a backup then at B6. That gives us this new alpha vector. And not only did it improve the value function at B6, but it also improved it at B5. So we're going to say, okay, that's good enough. We won't do a backup at B5. And then now we have none left to choose from. So this iteration is over. And then we'll just keep doing this. So this way, we're not actually doing quite as many updates as we would be doing for point-based value iteration. So this is really just a way to kind of save on some computational expense. Yes?
So compared to point-based value iteration, we're not keeping the bag of alpha vectors, but a randomized bag of beliefs for every single iteration. Do we keep track of multiple alpha vectors here, or just one that is for basically all the beliefs?
Good question. So the question was like, before we had like an alpha vector for every single belief, so we had like a bag of alpha vectors and a bag of beliefs. This time, so now like after this iteration, for example, we have like 3 alpha vectors. It turns out that the alpha vector in white is dominated, so we could, hopefully you guys talked last time about how to like prune alpha vectors. So you just want to keep track of all the ones that are not dominated. If you don't want to go through the pruning process, then you could also just keep track of all the ones that you keep getting every single iteration. But it won't be like one-to-one anymore, where you keep track of one alpha vector per belief. Any other questions? Yep.
So just to make sure I have this right, basically with each iteration, we're temporarily pruning all of the dominating. Well, sorry, you're removing all of the beliefs that lie along like the piecewise curve that like has now been added that like dominates the rest of them?
Yeah, it's kind of even simpler than that. So like, let's see. So if we go here, for example, so say we just performed our backup at B2. So the old value function at B2 was this white one. Now, if we look at what's the maximum there, it's the yellow one. Right. Similarly for V1, the old value function was this white one. And the new one is the yellow one. The new max is the yellow one. So that's basically all we have to do to decide is like, is it higher than what it used to be before we did this backup?
And then you remove all of those beliefs from consideration for the next.
Yeah, and so then to decide on the next belief, we're not going to pick one of those where it already improved. For example, though, at like B5, the old value function is still better than the new one we get from that alpha vector. So we still have room to improve it, and so we'll still keep it as like a candidate. And then when we picked like B6, we got a new alpha vector that improved both B5 and B6, and so we were done. And then we'll just start over all over again for like the next iteration.
Okay, so basically every time it sort of cycles through until all of the beliefs have better corresponding values, and then you add them all back when you do it again.
Yep, exactly. Any other questions on this? Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, here's kind of a summary of everything that we just saw. So QMDP and FIB, they got us the upper bounds on the value function, FIB being a little bit tighter but requiring a bit more computation. And then PBVI and randomized PBVI, they both give us lower bounds. But PBVI this time requires a little bit more computation because we're doing one update for every single belief at every iteration, whereas in the randomized case, we don't have to do this, but it doesn't get quite as tight of a lower bound. Okay, so now, what you've all been wondering, how do we actually, oh yeah, question?
Which of the two is more computationally expensive? The Just regular PBVI.
Yeah, because for every iteration, regular PBVI is going to, for sure, do an update at every single belief. Randomized PBVI, hopefully we get improvements of multiple beliefs at once, so we don't do an update on every single one. Yeah. Okay, so how do we actually pick these belief points in the first place? So the key insight here is that we really only care about having like an accurate estimate of the value function at beliefs that are reachable. So like if we think that we're never going to believe something, then there's kind of no reason to like plan for it. So, for example, when I'm like playing one-on-one basketball with my husband, he's 5'10", I never am going to ever believe that he could actually dunk the basketball, and so I'm never actually going to plan for that, right? So we really care about just having accurate estimates of the value function for beliefs that are reachable. Okay, so one way to do this is like super simple. It's just called random belief expansion. And so the idea is we just start from like some initial belief, probably like the belief that we would start with if we were going to execute our policy. And then we just simulate, we just pick some random action to take from this belief, simulate one step forward in time. So like just pick an observation and then see what next belief we end up at using our belief updater. And then we'll just keep that belief and add that to our back because this belief was clearly reachable by taking one of our actions from our initial belief. Then we'll just repeat the process with both of the beliefs that we now have in the bag. So just pick some random actions to take from them and add those beliefs, and we'll basically just keep doing this using a random policy. And we can do this for like some number of iterations depending on how many belief points we want to end up with. Okay, and this is all using a random policy, so we just kind of, every single time we have a belief, we just pick a random action and go one step forward to see our new belief. But you could imagine that like when we actually execute the policy, we're not just going to be using a random policy. We're hopefully going to be using something close to the optimal policy. We don't know what the optimal policy is, but we could probably get a better set of beliefs if we use something closer to the optimal policy. And so that's kind of the idea. If you ever heard of the SAR-sub algorithm for POMDPs, it does something like that. It does a little bit more of an intelligent belief selection beyond just using like a random policy. So you can check out, that paper is like cited in the book, and you can check it out if it's of interest. Okay, so that's one option. Another thing that you can do that's like a little bit smarter is called exploratory belief expansion. The idea here is also like pretty simple though, but the key kind of addition here is that not only do we want beliefs that are reachable, but ideally we kind of want like spread out beliefs. Because if we just get a bunch of beliefs that are reachable but they're all kind of in the same region, then we only have an accurate estimate of the value function in that kind of small region. And if we could like spread them out, we could probably get like a better estimate of the actual value function. So to do that, all we do is we say like, okay, let's start with our initial belief. And then we're going to simulate all possible actions that we could take from that belief. That's going to give us 3 new beliefs that we could have. And then we're going to say which belief is furthest from the current set of beliefs, from like all the different beliefs in the current set that we have. So in this case, it's pretty clear to see. This one is like the furthest away. So we're going to pick this belief, and we'll just add that to our current set of belief points. Then next time we do this again, we're going to simulate all of our different actions from the current belief that we're at. And then we're going to say for each one, for each set, like which one is furthest from the current set of beliefs. So this one here, even though it's the furthest from this belief, is actually near one of the other beliefs that we have in our set. So for all the actions for this one, we're actually going to pick A1, because that's the furthest from any belief that we already have in the set. And then similarly over here, we're going to pick A1 as well, actually. Yeah?
So what is the actual purpose of both of these? Is it to, like, when we go back to, like, the other algorithm to look at, basically reduce our belief space when we're, like, updating? Or, like, I might have missed the thing.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, like, what is the actual purpose? Which, yeah, I think probably could make more clear. So, like, the idea is, like, when we do PBVI or randomized PBVI, we still do have to pick, like, that candidate set of belief points. And so before I just said, like, oh, you're handed this set, but you do have to pick it when you're going to, like, run that algorithm. And so the idea is, like, if we're going to have to pick a set of belief points, we can only pick so many because we need our algorithm to be, like, computationally tractable. And so what we want to do is like we should pick ones that are reachable. We don't care about beliefs that we'll never believe, but also probably spread out because we're going to like get semi-accurate estimates of the value function like at our exact belief points that we calculate it for. So if we can keep them spread out, then like we'll be able to have a more accurate estimate like all over the belief space. Okay, and so then we would add this, and we would just keep repeating the process for exploratory belief expansion. Any questions on that? Okay. So yeah, just as like a summary from today, we learned two methods. These were all approximate POMDP methods. We learned how to get upper bounds using QMDP and fast-informed bound. And we learned how to get lower bounds using point-based value iteration and randomized point-based value iteration. These are all things that we would do offline. And then next week, you'll start talking about what you could do online that often takes advantage of these like upper and lower bounds. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
So just going back to the belief expansions, are you only thinking one kind of belief per iteration to add to your belief set? So, like, especially in the random one, like you generate a bunch of random next, like.
So in the random one, you'll like you'll pick one action per belief in your current set, and then you'll add the belief. So like here, we're actually going to double the amount of beliefs we have every iteration.
Oh, so it's is it an exponential sort of like accumulation of beliefs?
Yeah, but these are all just heuristics. So you could imagine like if you're like, oh, this is growing too fast, I want to like, not. And then I guess one way to deal with that is kind of the exploratory one, where well, actually no, you're right. It'll be the same thing. So yeah, you're always gonna double. In the two that I showed you, you're always gonna double the amount of beliefs that you had.
So wait, so
this one you doubled. I get why you chose them on the bottom corner. Why did you choose the other one?
This one?
Yeah.
Because this one is near one of the beliefs that we already have in the set. So we're looking at the maximum distance from any belief in our set.
Okay, so you do a separate distance calculation for each.
Yeah, so I'm like this one, I'll like look at the distance to here and the distance to here. I'll take the minimum of the two, and I'm like, well, it's pretty close to one of these. This one, I would look at the distance to here and the distance to here, but like this one's the one that dominates.
Okay. So you're. I think I understand. So you're still taking multiple. It's the same pattern as for the random one. In terms of the amount of beliefs you add.
Yes, it will be the same amount that you add every single time. Yeah. Yeah.
To clarify, are the like axes still the belief and the utility?
Oh, sorry, the axes here, this was actually assuming like a two-dimensional belief space. So this would be like B1 and B2.
Then I have a follow-on question. So, for example, if you said that you want to kind of get beliefs that are reachable and that we think are possible, what if they're like how do these expansion methods account for states and beliefs that we will it's like almost like a zero chance of that happening, but it gives us either a very high or a very low utility, and how do they account for that? So, for example, like a safety critical, say, aircraft case, it's like how do we actually believe that, for example, like two aircraft are actually gonna like level each other out?
Yeah, I guess so the question is kind of like, what if there are reachable states, but it's very rare? They're reachable beliefs, but it's very rare to reach them. But it really matters that we have an accurate estimate there. Is that kind of what the question is? Yeah, that's a great question. I think like maybe that would require some domain knowledge. Like if you know, like it would be bad to be in this. I want it to be accurate here. I just add it myself. Because again, these are really just heuristics.
So you can always like add expert information into any of these methods, right?
Yeah, you can always. So I mean, these are really just heuristics for picking the beliefs. If you want, you could just ignore all of this and pick them yourself. And like for the crying baby problem, I think like for the example in the book, they're like, yeah, I feel like 1/4 and 3/4, which is what they ended up using, feels good, and I think like that's also fine. So yeah, but good question. Yeah.
Is there an analogy between the point, what's it called, the point-based value iteration and like doing like some fitted Q iteration on the belief state MDP?
Oh yeah, good question. Okay, so the question was, is there an analogy between point-based value iteration and kind of like interpolating on a belief state MDP, like discretizing the belief space and interpolating? Yes. There is 100%, and I don't remember what it is, but there totally is. There's actually a reason that PBVI tends to have better properties than interpolating over the belief space. I just totally forgot what it is. But yeah, something you could definitely look up. Good question.
It's just like it learns more nearer to the states, the belief states that are more like.
It might be something like that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, sounds good. Well, enjoy your rainy Thursday, and I hope to see some of you in winter quarter.